Pat, I'm sitting here today talking to you in my tiny house, which is quite the story. I did the typical thing that you're supposed to do kind of coming up through life. I followed the prescription. I got my education after spending some time in the military and bought my first home, actually right before the Great Recession, and followed my career path and climbed the corporate ladder, and just came to a moment in the pandemic where I realized that that wasn't a good fit for me, and so started on this path towards tiny living that has really been quite a journey of aligning my personal life with my values.
Laura Lynch is known as the tiny house advisor. After a successful career in corporate America, Laura discovered that the burden of a traditional lifestyle was stifling her dreams. She yearned for more exploration and a greater connection with the outdoors. This is a story about crafting a life that is uniquely yours. It's about a shift from materialism to experiences, and it's a story of creating a life of meaning and joy. Please welcome Laura Lynch to Bump in the Road. Laura, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Yeah, I'd be so happy to, Pat. I'm sitting here today talking to you in my tiny house, which is quite the story. I did the typical thing that you're supposed to do, kind of coming up through life. I followed the prescription. I got my education after spending some time in the military and bought my first home, actually right before the Great Recession, and followed my career path and climbed the corporate ladder, and just came to a moment in the pandemic where I realized that that wasn't a good fit for me, and so started on this path towards tiny living that has really been quite a journey of aligning my personal life with my values. And so I know we probably want to explore that in more detail, but that is kind of my story. My story is one of doing what you're supposed to do and following the path, and then realizing that that's not a good fit, and so recreating a story that is a truer alignment.
How did you start to explore going deeper into your values?
Yeah, so, I guess I have to credit Brene Brown and her book Dare to Lead with kind of a realization around that we have core values or things that we hold true into ourselves. I believe in psychology around the ideas of mirror neurons and the fact that we often hold things that are important to us that probably aren't our own values, that we're sort of doing the values that other people have told to us. And so when you sit down with a values worksheet, or I think there's some great tech tools out there now where you can really narrow down what is resonant to you, the key words or people or experiences, whatever it is that really resonate with you, as opposed to things that you think should be important to you. It can be such a revelation because you'll realize that those things have always been following you. So I read that book, Dare to Lead, and I sat down with my husband and said, hey, let's work through this values worksheet. And we spent a lot of time narrowing down the whole scope of what could be important down to what are those just couple of things that have always been driving my decisions and have always been the things that I've been aspiring to. And for me, one thing is independence, and the other is exploration. I tend to, like my dog, get bored easily, and I need to be kind of seeing new people, exploring new places. And so when I realized that, I realized, hey, my life that I'm living right now of doing what I'm supposed to do in my corporate career and staying in one place and having this, 2,300 square foot roof over my head don't allow me to feel independent. They make me feel very dependent. And also, they're not allowing me to explore. And I need the mountains, and I need some wild spaces, and I need some public lands, and I need my feet to trod on trails. And so that exercise was really fundamental to figuring out a way to shift life to be more in alignment with my true self, which I really feel like creates a sense of fulfillment and happiness that we don't have when we're just doing what we think we're supposed to do.
You've really gone from an orientation that is outside of yourself to an orientation that is within.
Yes, I would say that is very true. And I think we all are kind of socialized to do what maybe our parents showed us, or society shows us, or the screens in front of us show us, and instead look within to listen to my own voice. And my own voice has been very loud, but I've been ignoring it or had been ignoring it for a long time. Everybody else knows better. I should just do what I'm supposed to do and what people tell me to do. And when you start listening to your own voice and following your own path, I think that is where creativity comes from, and where solutions to problems come from, and where invention comes from, is when we listen internally instead of just sort of mirroring the world around us.
Now, you have a job that you can do from anywhere. What
Yes.
about your husband? What does he do?
Yeah. So Eric has been in the trades for his entire life. And so he has a great ability now to also shift his focus and do the things from a trade perspective that he actually likes better, which is really awesome because he's been an electrician since his first words were my cord as an electrical cord when he was a little kid. And yet at the same time, what he really, loved as a child was Tonka trucks and digging. And so now he gets to build a business around doing dirt work and excavation and things that he actually likes better than maybe troubleshooting electrical problems. Even though he's very good at all the things, he gets to focus on what he really loves the most.
What was the most difficult part of this transition of going from the suburban house to ridding yourself of probably most of the things you've accumulated? What went into that?
Yeah, so I would have called myself a minimalist. I, spent a number of years in the military and moving around with the military, and that kind of teaches you not to be too attached to things. But then my middle age hit where I became the sole girl heir in my family to a lot of family legacy items. And so it has been quite a journey of sort of addressing my sense of responsibility for carrying on some family items that my parents and grandparents treasured, acknowledging, appreciating, honoring their treasuring, and yet also saying, I'm not going to let these things keep me trapped in a mortgage and a sort of lifestyle churn that isn't going to be true for me or freeing for me. And so it has been really hard. I would say downsizing is an iterative process, and you start with the easy stuff first, right? The things that you haven't touched in several years that you feel no really sense of value. And then each time you have to downsize, you have to dig a little deeper into the things that maybe you have some sort of attachment and you're not sure why you're attached to those things. So it's a lot of self exploration, and sometimes I'm like, this is really hard. This is really hard for me to go through what I know my grandmother really loved about her china collection and make choices about which pieces I'm going to take with me in order to always have that connection, and what I'm going to have to let go of in order to allow me to move on to this next phase.
And I think when you start letting go of things, you realize nobody else wants your stuff.
In
And
today's day and age, it seems that's so true. People aren't valuing those things as much.
and that's kind of eye-opening in terms of what is your stuff about?
Yes. Yes, very often our stuff is about a sense of duty, of carrying on that family legacy, or related to some sort of memory or relationship. I've noticed with other people, they seem to collect all the gifts that they've ever been given, and they sort of, attach to that feeling that they had with that person. And yet we have to remember that we can have those same feelings with a picture of the thing. You don't actually have to have the thing, and that our relationships don't live in the stuff. They actually live in our mind and in our hearts. And so it takes a little bit of perspective shift, but certainly a deep dive into why do I feel connected with this particular thing or these collections of things, is hard work. Even for someone who hasn't really been that materialistic in the past, it is hard work and something you should have some compassion around taking the time to do it and not expecting yourself to like downsize overnight, because it is a little bit harder than you would imagine when you first, get rid of the first layer of easy stuff.
Where did you find a home for all your old stuff?
Well, I am not an expert at being the best person for this. And it's another struggle because we know that much of our stuff that we donate may end up actually in the trash, which is hard. So, for some things that were particularly large and I thought might be of value of to someone, I typically would, use Facebook Marketplace with a very low price point in order to help, say, the sewing machine go to someone who might be really into that, or the clock or what have you. For the clothing items, obviously that was sort of a goodwill situation. It was the things like the china that I inherited, where I, found a good, place to send them, a good cause where I felt like maybe they would end up in someone else's, collection or what have you. But there are so many great and needy, I would say, charities out there. If you can search in your local community and find a good one, I think it's worth a little extra effort rather than just sort of dropping it off in a bin somewhere where it might end up in the trash.
So you not only moved into a tiny house, but you also relocated.
Yes.
Tell us
Yes.
about that.
Yeah, the geographical location, the tiny house, my career shift, all of these are intertwined. The geographical move was really partially about that need for exploration. I grew up in the mountains and, having some national forest around me, and I miss that a lot. And so it was aligning with that need to explore and to hike with my dogs, which is basically my, my only favorite hobby. Um, but also it was about taking ourselves to a place where the cost of living was gonna and the tiny house was gonna be allowed, and therefore reducing our overall need for income and creating more financial independence. So the tiny house we built, ourselves, from the trailer up years ago. And so we owe nothing here. And so we went from mortgage and more traditional home to tiny house and completely debt free, which allowed me to shift my career, shift my geography, and shift my entire way of living to be a little bit more independent and a less tied into that kind of hamster wheel of, career, corporate ladder, mortgage, all the bills, not allowing you to design a life around what's most important to you.
What are some of the glitches you ran into in establishing a tiny house?
Yeah. So tiny house living is not a paved road. There is not a big industry out there lobbying for a paved path for tiny living. There are grassroots organizations. I'm a volunteer for the Tiny Home Industry Association that's working on international codes to help elevate the legalization of tiny living, but anytime someone chooses a different path, and tiny living can be so broad. It can be, digital nomad, living in Airbnbs, RV, tiny house, yurt, earthship, van life, schoolies, like all the things, right? Anytime you choose something different than the paved, regular, traditional, 430,000, $430,000 average home, you're going to have to be a little bit gritty about getting there. And so some of the glitches are finding legal parking when it comes to any of those things, and especially tiny homes. So, one of the things that we did was try to follow a legal path. When we first brought our tiny home to our land in New Mexico, there was a permit, a building permit that had tiny homes on it. But at the time, there wasn't any certifying body that could let our municipality know that our tiny home was built in a safe manner and no way to get a certificate of occupancy. Today, there are certifying bodies out there that can allow a municipality to feel comfortable with a tiny home, but this was back in 2017. But finding legal parking is one of the most challenging parts of choosing a tiny home. There are tiny home communities popping up. There are rural places with no building codes where you can live in a tiny home. If you take one on the road in an RV capacity where you're traveling with it, there are RV parks that welcome tiny homes, but it requires just a little bit more research than just buying a regular home.
What do you do about utilities?
So we actually do have power here. This place where we're sitting, our tiny home, is in a platted subdivision from decades ago. So we actually have power here. We collect rainwater, which is something that's encouraged in New Mexico. So we use rainwater, with the exception of we haven't filtered it yet for drinking. So we use it for everything else. And so we're off grid when it comes to water and on grid when it comes to power.
You bought this land a while ago. When you bought it, did you buy it with the intention of a tiny home, or did you know where you were going with that purchase?
Yeah, so we had no idea where we were going with that purchase. This was a purely impulsive, and emotional purchase, as many life decisions tend to be. I had lived in Nevada when I was attached with the Air Force. And so I really miss the West. Once again, that sense of exploration that's always calling to me was really calling to me after I had been in Florida for a little while and felt sort of, uh, unable to get out into open spaces very easily. And so we took a couple different trips out west and explored a variety of different areas out here, trying to look for land. And then when we came here to Abiquiu, New Mexico, we found this dot on a Zillow map, and it was on an online site that buys up tax lien land and then sells it with owner financing. And so we kind of purchased the land after just being on it for 15 minutes on our way to the airport, but it was, pretty inexpensive. And then when we got back home, we're like, what are we going to do with that 8 acres that we just purchased? And that's how the idea for the tiny house was born.
Oh, that's such a great story. Is there anything you miss about the traditional big house?
So, about the traditional big house, definitely, living in 300 square feet serves well for the functions of, just eating, cooking, bathing, watching TV, sleeping. But when it comes to things like working from home, running two businesses out of your tiny home, that's where I would say that maybe some more functional space is useful. And so, what we have designed here on our property is more additional spaces. So I have a studio building that we're still working on, where I'll ultimately be working out of, so that I'm not kind of cramming everything into one space. And then likewise, my husband has a large shop for all of his heavy equipment and tools. So even though our overall living footprint is small and tiny, I would say that our footprint of the functional use space. And so oftentimes traditional homes, are really designed around what are your bedrooms and bathrooms. And now more so homes are being built with workspaces included. So offices are being built into new homes. And so I would say that to some degree, the larger space of the larger home is missed, but being reproduced in a more functional way here. But otherwise, I can't really say that there's anything that I miss that much about having a 2,300 square foot home.
Emotionally, what's the change being in a tiny home?
So there was the part about, kind of cleansing oneself of other stuff that has been emotional. Change is always emotional, right? Anytime you're making big change in your life. And in our case, we changed, of course, geography and living space and just the way that we're operating on a day-to-day basis. What does the routine look like? And so I think an important part anytime anyone is changing anything about their life is, addressing the emotions and having compassion for the fact that things might be hard and bumpy and not feel very smooth. And part of change, the hardest part is getting started with any project. Just taking those first steps are really hard sometimes. And then once you get into the swing of that, then it seems less hard. But just acknowledging that, change is hard and that the very beginning of it is particularly difficult, and having some emotional, sort of free compassion and empathy for yourself, I think can be really useful.
I was listening to one of your podcasts, and one of your guests said one of the things that she found in living a more minimalistic lifestyle was joy.
Yeah, and I think that that comes from the fact that we forget how much the stuff owns us. So not only do we own the stuff, but the stuff can own us. And so when we get rid of fewer things that kind of tie us up, the more freedom that we may feel. So for example, we are still holding on to a good amount of work stuff, tools, and equipment, and kind of keeping consideration of the maintenance required of all of those things and keeping them out of the weather and making sure that everything's running smoothly and making sure that nothing's getting stolen in the back of your truck when you go into town. All of those things can kind of wear you down. And so the less that we have, oftentimes, the fewer responsibilities to those things, the less maintenance of those things, the fewer hours maybe in the gadget store getting things repaired. All of that can just free up some joy in our lives.
What advice do you have for somebody contemplating a tiny home?
So, the very first thing that one has to think about is the format of kind of what tiny living and exploring the different options, because it really is about the lifestyle that you want to have. Tiny homes in particular are very often best suited permanently placed just because they're not as towable, say. If you are more interested in travel, there's other ways of doing similar lifestyle in van, RV, even homesteading full time is something one of my podcasts has done. And then from there, you have to kind of figure out where you're going to want to put your tiny home so that you can do enough due diligence to make sure that you're going to be able to do tiny living where you want to be. Sometimes people make the mistake of finding a really good deal on a very beautiful tiny home and purchasing it, and then realizing that the place that they want to live won't allow it. So, first it's kind of what, and then where would be the first two most important questions to ask when exploring tiny living.
If you could rewrite any part of your story, would you?
So I think this is a such a great question, Pat, because I think all of us would rewrite many, or maybe not everybody, but in my case, I would have rewritten many parts of my story in many times of the past. But I think as I get older, I start to realize that life is like a tapestry, and that all the different changes and switching directions and pivots and things that I have done in my life are all woven together to create the complexity of my life that exists today. Had I not camped as a child, I probably wouldn't have ever known or considered a tiny house, because this feeds into what I had fun doing as a kid. And then I have changed directions in my life a number of different times from a career perspective. I've been divorced. I've moved around a number of different times. I've certainly adjusted my own perspective on the world and my belief system so many different times. And had I not sort of meandered around a lot and brought all these different threads of life together, I wouldn't have the life that I have today. But I don't know that I would have necessarily recognized it that way maybe 5 years ago.